Good morning. I'm Tim Gerdeman, Vice Chair and Co-founder and Chief Marketing Officer of Water Tower Research. I'm being joined today for this special WTR Small Cap Spotlight Flashcast podcast by my colleague Dmitry Silversteyn, WTR Chemicals and Materials Equity Research Analyst, to discuss his key takeaways and potential investment opportunities tied to last week's Defense Production Act signed by President Trump. Dmitry, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Tim. It's great to be here again.
So, Dmitry, last week, as you know, President Trump signed an executive order invoking the Defense Production Act, referencing that, and I quote, "Our national and economic security are now acutely threatened by our reliance upon hostile foreign powers' mineral production." Also mentioned last week was that it is imperative for our national security that the United States take immediate action to facilitate domestic mineral production to the maximum possible extent. So all of that having been said, Dmitry, from your perspective, what was the reasoning behind this executive order, and what does it involve specifically as far as federal government actions and attitudes toward domestic mining and processing of critical minerals?
Sure, Tim. Thank you for the question. Well, I think we can start by first defining what a critical mineral is, or what are critical minerals that are included in this order. And we're basically talking about metals and minerals that are critical to the electrification or the decarbonization market trend and industry trend and world trend, frankly, that is taking place today. So everything from EVs to electrical motors to the data centers, you name it, requires batteries, requires magnets, requires materials that need to be extracted and processed, extracted from the earth and processed to make into usable forms. So that's why you have metals such as lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, this is why you have fertilizers like phosphate and potash included in that, because obviously food security and being independent of foreign source for fertilizer to make sure we can grow our food is also important. And the reasons why this order was deemed necessary, I guess I would say, is the dominance in these metals when it comes to sourcing and particularly processing and refining that China, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Indonesia were able to acquire and now are basically dominating the production of these metals, in effect, having the ability to hold the rest of the world hostage to their geopolitical needs and opportunities. They've shown the willingness to use this dependence of the world on these minerals as a way to drive their political agenda. We've seen countries, China in particular, use rare earth export bans. We've seen them use lithium technology export bans. We've seen them overproduce lithium and cobalt in an effort to keep the prices low and to keep that incremental producer who may be located outside of their control from producing or for getting into production if it's a developing company. So there are plenty of reasons why this order was necessary because of the geopolitical situation of today. With respect to what does the order actually does, it contains four major elements. There is the priority or prioritizations of projects, which basically requires the associated agencies to lay out a timetable for identifying the projects that are currently have either a plan of production or a permit application or other application that needs approval that was submitted to a federal agency and is sitting there waiting for approval. It looks then to prioritize those subjects, those projects for to basically come up with a list of those that are ready for immediate approval, provided everything is in order, and then to establish a schedule for hearings and actually issuing those approvals. The second part of it is amending or clarifying the Mining Act of 1872, and the president there is asking the Department of Interior to clarify the treatment of waste rock, tailings, and other waste deposits, mine waste deposits that are associated with mining and extracting of metals, to make sure that we're obeying all of the latest current environmental requirements without overburdening these projects with unnecessary regulations. Next, we have the land use of minerals projects, which basically asks the government agencies to come up with a list of federal lands known to contain these deposits or reserves, prioritize production of such reserves as the primary use for that land, and identify sites on federal land that can be suitable for leasing or development by private companies. And then finally, coming off of that, there is a provision for accelerating private and public capital investments to make loans, loan guarantees, and equity investments, as well as participate in potential offtake agreements with these companies to help them get into production, to help them provide a base load of demand so they can actually get to cash flow positive quicker and enable these companies and projects to flourish.
Okay, that's a really helpful overview. So given all that, Dmitry, what do you think are the practical implications of this executive order, assuming its actions are carried out as laid out last week? And also as an add-on, what effect can it potentially have on domestic mining and processing industries and industry participants, in your opinion?
Well, I think in short, this order, if carried out as intended, and if consequences of this order are as intended, it should streamline the regulatory and permitting process, at least at the federal level. Obviously, the companies will still have to deal with the local and state provisions. It will make federal funds, federal land available for resource exploration and eventual exploitation. It will highlight some domestic projects and companies that may benefit from a streamlined and accelerated approval process. And it can certainly get into helping with investment. And we talked about, I think last time I was on this podcast, we talked about the fact that particularly the juniors and the exploration companies have really struggled raising private capital given the depressed metal prices. Having federal funds step into this void and enable some of this capital to find its place to the most promising projects, I think will be a major step forward. And as far as which companies will benefit from it, it could be anybody from majors like BHP or Rio Tinto or SQM or Albemarle, all of which have projects on US soil that can be expanded. In other words, a brownfield expansion versus a completely greenfield expansion. It would also encourage them to do more exploratory work in the US rather than in Canada or other parts of the world. It should also help junior developers who are on the verge of production but have run into various regulatory hurdles or delays. And we're talking about companies like Piedmont Lithium, Lithium Americas, Westwater Resources, which is a graphite manufacturer that's trying to ramp up production in Alabama, I believe, and the metals company, TMC, whose resources not in the Americas, it's actually in the bottom of the ocean, but who have talked about being very willing to ship those nodules to a US location for processing. And that's where the real value add comes in if the regulatory environment and the financial support is there. And I could also mention companies that we've actually met with at the PDEC conference a few weeks ago, who are a little bit further behind, maybe 3 to 5 years behind in terms of getting into production. I'm talking about companies like American Lithium, Jindalee Lithium, Encore Energy, Energy Fuels, which are uranium companies, Ioneer and Ivanhoe Electric, among others.
Great. No shortage of companies for investors to be looking at based on that comment.
Absolutely. And as I said, the key there is for a lot of these companies is getting the regulatory framework as streamlined as possible and having access to capital. Because again, especially the junior ones and the developing companies that are engaged in the development of resources, they burn through cash pretty quickly. So having access to non-dilutive funds or capital would be critical to their success.
Another thought I just had, actually real time, now that I think about it, my recollection is that the International Seabed Authority is again convening in Jamaica soon to continue its work to develop a mining code that would allow the responsible exploitation of mineral resources found in oceans, specifically international waters that are outside of the jurisdiction of any one individual government. And not coincidentally, I believe media outlets, including Bloomberg, have run articles of late that appear to argue against development of seabed resources, primarily based on environmental concerns. You've been observing the seabed mining industry closely for the past several years, Dmitry. What can you tell our audience about the state of the industry, ISA's work, and the veracity of the environmental arguments being used?
Well, there's a lot in there to unpack, Tim, but I'll try to go through this really quickly. ISA, International Seabed Authority, you mentioned, it's basically an agency set up by UN. It has 168 member states plus the European Union. U.S. is not a signatory to the Treaty of the Seas, and is not a formal part of this club, if you will. But they are an observer, and they do weigh in on certain functions and certain policies of this organization. They were set up for one reason and one reason only, and that is to develop regulations for exploitation of minerals found at the bottom of the ocean in international waters. Now, they have run into a lot of problems. This was supposed to have been done probably a decade ago, now that I think about it, but it keeps getting postponed because of geopolitical opposition and because of environmental group oppositions. If you look at companies that are, or countries, member countries that are looking to either ban or put a moratorium of some sort on mining, who are these? Well, they're current major terrestrial miner nations. They are company or countries like France and Germany who are concerned about the environment, but don't seem to be willing to do anything about improving it. The good thing about it is that China is also a member of ISA, and they are very interested in developing the resources they have, and they have been pressuring ISA behind the scenes to finish their regulatory the regulatory draft of the final regulatory regulations. With the U.S. now getting more involved, a much friendlier administration in power right now. If you look at people who have been nominated to the UN, if you look at Marco Rubio, who's been a proponent of deep sea mining for some time, it looks like the US may actually put its thumb on a scale in terms of pushing this over the line. Now, you mentioned that every time there is a meeting of ISA, which happens about 2 or 3 times a year, there's a cluster of media articles that come out talking about the environmental concerns. To put that in perspective, are there a lot of unknowns? Yes. But everything that we do know, and we have hundreds of terabytes of data now examining what the undersea environment looks like, what the ecosystems looks like, what the impact of disturbing or mining the seafloor looks like, and what impact it has and does not have. And so far, a lot of the data has been contradicting or frankly debunking a lot of the myths around how high the plume, for example, rises, which is the sediment off the floor that gets kicked up when there's mining operations going on. Or how damaging the noise of operations may be to the marine life. Remember, we're talking about a resource that sits, 10,000 meters below. I mean, that's as far below as airplanes fly high. The biodiversity at that level, the biomass is negligible. When people talk about all of these uncovered new specimens, they were uncovered because TMC, the metals company, actually went down there and found them on these nodules. And there's no reason to believe that these are unique or exclusive to this area. But even if they are, specifically in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, which TMC is involved with, 40% of that territory, that seafloor, has been set aside by ISA for environmental conservation reasons and will never be mined. So we're talking about a fraction of the seafloor that is actually getting exposed here. And if you look at benchmark resources, if you look at other consulting agencies that have done the work, the environmental impact of deep sea mining and processing of the resultant ore or resultant resource is factors, and in some cases orders of magnitude lower than any terrestrial mining. So if you have to transition to electrified future, if you will, if you have to have these metals and they have to be gotten from somewhere, it is a lot more environmentally, or it's a lot less environmentally impactful to get them from the seafloor in these essentially dead zones than it is from land, where you have to strip the rainforest, where you have to displace indigenous communities, and you have to deal with tons and tons and tons of waste and byproducts that you don't want.
Yep, as a scuba diver, I can relate to what you just said. So moving on, Dmitry, you mentioned TMC as it relates to the efforts made by some private companies to collect and analyze environmental data on the deep sea environment and ecosystems to make informed decisions regarding environmental aspects of seabed mining regulations. How would this company's efforts and plans fit into the administration's executive order from last week?
Well, let's talk about what the resource is for a second. As I mentioned, it lies at the bottom of the floor. There's no mining in the traditional sense of the word. These are literally, golf-sized to potato-sized nodules that contain, in the case of TMC's resources, 4 critical metals: nickel, copper, cobalt, and manganese, without which you can't make a battery, without which you can't make an electric motor. They are contained in very high concentrations, and TMC has developed a process, a flow sheet that they've proven at commercial scale, or I'm sorry, at pilot scale, that they can actually process these nodules and get virtually zero waste. We talked about at the beginning of this podcast about the need to sort of relook at the old Mining Act to see if some of the waste regulations can be reduced or loosened. There's no need for that with these polymetallic nodules. TMC is planning to submit their exploitation application to ISA, and hopefully that'll start the clock ticking on a 1-year time frame that ISA has to approve that. So willy-nilly, it looks like we are at a point where we're getting close to actually having commercial mining at these depths and of this resource. The good thing about these nodules is once they're collected on a ship, they can be shipped to any port that has the proper facilities to offload and get them to a rail or to another transportation system to get them further inland. Right now, TMC's has a memorandum of understanding with the Japanese nickel processor to process these nodules at their facility, but they have been very vocal about their preference for having the processing of their nodules done in the US or at least in North America. And I think the streamlining of regulations and the capital that maybe become available as a result of the executive order will expedite that decision-making process and will allow them to find a home for these nodules in the US, making the US virtually independent when it comes to at least these 4 metals. This resource is that large. It can actually produce 250 million EV batteries, or batteries for 250 million EV vehicles.
Great. That comment you just made on logistics is also fascinating. I had not thought about that. So in wrapping up, Dmitry, you mentioned myriad public companies earlier in our podcast. Any other small cap names that should be on investors' radar screens if the regulatory environment becomes more favorable for mining critical minerals?
Absolutely, and this may be a little bit of a backdoor way of playing this trend if it does develop. But companies like Materion, which is involved in rare earth magnets and catalysts and things like that. Companies like Graphtec, which makes synthetic graphite, but synthetic graphite is a material that's used in battery technology as well. So to the extent there has to be a U.S. source for that, they would be an excellent candidate to benefit. Rogers Corporation would be another company. And Ecovist, people don't really think of that as a mining company, but they're one of the biggest sulfuric acid manufacturers. And sulfuric acid is a key process chemicals when you're trying to get metal out of the ore. So I think as the metal industry and the mining industry and processing industry grows, Ecovist can benefit from that trend as well.
Great. That's really helpful to have all those incremental names to be doing some due diligence on for investors. So thank you for letting us glean insights into your key takeaways surrounding last week's critical minerals executive order, Dmitry, as this remains a critical issue that is on many investors' radar screens. To read Dmitry's industry and company-specific equity research reports, as well as to access countless other small-cap equity research reports from Water Tower Research, please go to www.watertowerresearch.com.
Thank you very much.